In 1950, the city of Chester, Pennsylvania, was home to over 66,000 residents. Just 20 years later, by 1970, over 10,000 people had already abandoned Chester. By 2010, a staggering 32,000 people, nearly half of Chester's 1950 population, had fled in search of a better life elsewhere. When the 2020 census figures were released, the data showed Chester's population had plummeted to just 32,605, barely half of what it was at its 20th century peak just 70 years earlier. From industrial powerhouse to urban wasteland in just decades, this is the harrowing story of Chester, Pennsylvania's spectacular descent. This city, founded in 1682 by William Penn himself, holds the distinction of being the oldest in the state of Pennsylvania. In its earliest days, Chester was known as Mecoponaca by the native Okahawking tribe, a name meaning the stream along which large potatoes grow. The area's first European settlers were the New Sweden colonists, who established Fort Mecoponaca in 1641 to defend their settlement, then called Finlandia or Upland. By 1682, when William Penn arrived and renamed it Chester after the English city, Upland was already the most populous town in the new province of Pennsylvania. Penn recognized its strategic location and economic potential, establishing Chester as the county seat for the vast Chester County that originally stretched from the Delaware to the Susquehanna River. In the 18th century, Chester played a small but important role in the American Revolutionary War. It hosted nearly 1,000 troops under Colonel Samuel Miles, preparing to defend Philadelphia in 1776. The following year, the Continental Army under George Washington passed through on their way to the Battle of Brandywine, briefly occupying the town after their defeat before retreating to Philadelphia. But it was in the 19th century that Chester truly emerged as an economic powerhouse. Its prime location on the Delaware allowed easy transport of raw materials and finished goods by ship, making it a hub for the booming textile and manufacturing industries. Textile giants like the Upland Mills and Powhatan Mills arose, their machinery becoming the rhythmic heartbeat of an industrializing city. The shipbuilding industry, however, proved to be Chester's greatest claim to fame. The 1871 opening of the Delaware River Iron Shipbuilding and Engine Works ushered in an era of unprecedented growth and prosperity under owner John Roach. Within 15 years, it became the largest and most productive shipyard in the United States, outpacing its two closest competitors combined in total tonnage. Roach's ambition and vertical integration were key to this dominance. He established a network of supporting businesses: the Chester Rolling Mill, Chester Pipe and Tube Company, Standard Steel Casting Company, and more, to supply his shipyard with materials like metal hull plates, pipes, and steel ingots. At its peak, over 100,000 workers toiled at Roach's industrial empire along the Chester waterfront. The early 20th century brought more prosperity as the city's industrial base further diversified. The Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company launched in 1917, complementing Roach's already massive shipbuilding operations. During the two world wars, Chester became a true boomtown as the city's factories and shipyards worked around the clock. The Sun Yard incredibly became the largest single shipyard in the world during World War II. This insatiable demand for labor attracted waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as African American migrants from the South seeking jobs and new opportunities. Between 1910 and 1920 alone, Chester's population swelled from 38,000 to 58,000 as it transformed into a diverse industrial melting pot. The urban landscape changed rapidly to accommodate this boom. Grand architectural symbols of Chester's economic might, like the Delaware County National Bank Building, 1724 Chester Courthouse, and Chester Waterside Power Station, arose. The Ford Motor Company chose Chester for a major assembly plant in 1927 that would produce vehicles for over 30 years. By the middle of the 20th century, Chester seemed unstoppable. Its industries formed the backbone of the regional economy. It was a classic boomtown attaining prosperity through grueling labor, attracting multitudes chasing the American dream. The shipyards, textile mills, manufacturing plants, and assembly lines drew workers from near and far, creating a rich social tapestry in this city on the rise. Yet even at its peak, the seeds of Chester's decline were being sown through a convergence of economic, social, and political forces that would ultimately shatter this industrial powerhouse. The death began ringing for Chester's manufacturing base in the latter half of the 20th century. The first major blow was the steady loss of the city's industrial anchor, manufacturing jobs. As early as the 1960s, major plants and factories began closing their doors to a rapidly changing economic landscape. In 1961, the Ford Motor Company shuttered its Chester assembly plant after over 30 years of operations, putting thousands out of work. At the sprawling Sun shipyard, employment plummeted from a W-2 peak of 35,000 down to just 4,000 by 1962 as demand contracted. Other giants like the American Viscose Corporation in nearby Marcus Hook shut down completely. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Eddystone was on the brink of bankruptcy, part of the nationwide turbulence in locomotive manufacturing. What had once been an industrial utopia now hemorrhaged jobs at an alarming rate, and as the generation-defining employers shrank or disappeared, so did Chester's population as residents sought work elsewhere. The 1950 census recorded over 66,000 Chestonians, but just 60 years later, that number had halved to under 33,000. But the dire economic conditions masked deeper systemic issues that made Chester's path from prosperity to plight even more treacherous. The post-World War II era brought the civil rights movement's harsh spotlight on the de facto segregation still pervading the city's public schools and neighborhoods. In 1963 through 1964, the Chester school protests erupted after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, seeking to end the racial segregation of schools. Leaders like George Raymond and Stanley Branch of the NAACP and CFFN led boycotts, marches, and sit-ins that soon turned violent, drawing resistance from police and city leaders. Chester earned the grim moniker, the Birmingham of the North, as civil rights titans like Gloria Richardson, Malcolm X, and Dick Gregory arrived to support the demonstrations. After over 600 arrests, the state ordered desegregation of Chester's all-black schools, though implementation faced repeated delays. These racial tensions compounded the city's economic woes, exacerbating population flight as middle-class families departed in droves. Chester's urban core and community fabric got worse, leaving those remaining mired in poverty, crime, and hopelessness. Toxic forces of corruption also hollowed Chester from within as organized crime and crooked politicians festered for decades. The city's Republican political machine, one of America's oldest, maintained an iron grip on local government through graft and vice until the 1990s. Mayors like John Necrelli served prison time for taking bribes connected to illicit gambling rackets. A 1990s state crime commission excoriated Chester's triad of criminals, corrupt politicians, and rogue law enforcement, controlling the city since the 1960s. Even before the factories and jobs fled, a culture of backroom dealing and rampant cronyism took root. It was a perfect storm, an economic base crumbling under globalization's shifting tides, deep-seated social and racial inequities perpetuating injustice, and criminal elements exploiting the city's desperation. Each factor exacerbated and perpetuated the others in a cyclical downward spiral. Over just a few turbulent decades, Chester devolved from industrial juggernaut to urban wasteland. Abandoned factories, business closures, and residential flight turned once vibrant neighborhoods into ghettos. Soaring unemployment, poverty, crime, and urban decay plagued the city as it bled residents and resources. Chester's evolution mirrored that of other former manufacturing hubs, crippled by similar toxic combinations of deindustrialization, institutional racism, and municipal mismanagement. With every closing factory, every exodus of middle-class families, every crime wave, the city's tax base collapsed. Less revenue made reinvestment to attract new industries or improve deteriorating infrastructure impossible. It was a vicious cycle Chester simply could not overcome through that period of upheaval. The catalysts of Chester's decline were both economic and deeply rooted in societal injustices. Globalization collapsed its industrial backbone, while segregation cleaved its social fabric. Corruption from within accelerated the implosion. No longer a mighty engine of industrial might, Chester hurtled from prosperity to plight in a shockingly short span. The aftermath of Chester's precipitous decline from industrial powerhouse to urban wasteland left widespread devastation in its wake that still scars the community today. As factories closed and residents fled, whole sections of the city became grim ghettos pocked by boarded-up businesses, abandoned buildings, and decaying infrastructure. The shuttering of major employers like the shipyards, assembly plants, and mills deprived Chester of its economic lifeblood. With jobs disappearing, sizable portions of the population had no choice but to leave the city they called home in search of employment elsewhere. Those who remained faced a harsh new reality of poverty, crime, and crumbling infrastructure. The abandoned storefronts, factories, and decaying buildings lining Chester's streets served as scorching reminders of how sharply the once booming city's fortunes had fallen. As the population dwindled from over 66,000 in 1950 to under 33,000 by 2022 consensus, Chester's tax base withered. There were fewer residents to fund and maintain basic civic services like policing, firefighting, schools, road repairs, and blight remediation. It created a vicious feedback loop where skyrocketing crime, dilapidated infrastructure, and underfunded public programs drove even more people and investment from the city. The human toll of this widespread destitution cannot be overstated. Once thriving working-class families found themselves trapped in cycles of poverty, joblessness, and despair. Drug abuse, crime, and violence became epidemics as a sense of hopelessness pervaded the remaining population. Chester's reputation shifted from industrial hub to a notorious urban hellscape plagued by blight and vice. The psychological and emotional impacts of living amid such urban decay cannot be overstated. Numerous studies link high rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and other mental health issues to environments like those created by Chester's decline. With jobs, businesses, and residents fleeing in droves, a self-perpetuating cycle of community disintegration took hold. For decades, Chester's woes seemed insurmountable as the city languished amid endemic poverty, blight, crime, and municipal mismanagement. However, rays of hope began penetrating the gloom in the 21st century through public and private reinvestment initiatives aimed at sparking revival. The Pennsylvania Keystone Opportunity Zone program helped catalyze development by granting tax incentives for companies investing in designated blighted areas like Chester. Revitalization projects like the $60 million wharf at Rivertown renovation transformed the city's historic Philadelphia Electric Company power station into a modern commercial and recreational hub. Gambling and professional sports franchises also placed bets on Chester's potential renaissance. Harrah's Philadelphia Casino opened in 2007, followed 3 years later by the construction of Subaru Park, home stadium for Major League Soccer's Philadelphia Union. While instrumental in generating economic activity and tax revenue, these projects could not single-handedly undo the systemic damage from decades of industrial decline, residential flight, impoverished schools, and crumbling infrastructure. Attracting new businesses and residents remains an uphill battle requiring high levels of public and private investment, job creation, and blight remediation. Tragically, Chester's compounding crises culminated in its own municipal bankruptcy filing in 2022, after a state of fiscal emergency was declared 2 years prior. The 31st U.S. city to take such drastic measures since the Great Depression, Chester's Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceedings underscore just how dire its situation remains. While rags to rags stories have played out in former industrial powerhouses across America's Rust Belt, Chester's arc represents an entire region's boom and bust cycle, encapsulated in a single city just miles from the Philadelphia city limits. From Lenape hunting grounds to Swedish colonial outpost to driving force of the 19th century's Industrial Revolution and beyond, this city's history is nothing if not resilient. The real test of that resiliency lies in whether Chester can do a third act as a phoenix risen from the ashes of its former self. Share your thoughts on Chester's story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our future releases as we continue to shed light on the different fallen cities of America.